Those testimonies and willingness to share and to engage with God and others. So yeah, thank you so much. I think many of us could keep on sharing more. So my title of my sermon today is What Will God Ask of Us? But first, Happy New Year. We're in the year of the Blue Dragon. So, can anyone tell me then, what qualities do you think a blue dragon might possess? What are the qualities of a dragon?
Authority.
Authority, maybe?
Being fearless.
Fearless. Success.
Burning fire.
Burning fire. Yeah. Anything else?
Good fortune.
Good fortune. Super. So, the dragon is a symbol of strength, authority, and success, certainly in Japanese culture. Sufan, do you have perhaps a Chinese explanation of the year of the dragon?
I think that's
Yes, it's similar to Japan. Yeah. Yukiya-san, any Asian knowledge to add? No. Okay, so here in the West, the dragon is often seen as perhaps a mythical creature. It might live in a cave, might hoard gold, might go out pillaging in the night, terrorizing local towns and farmers. But in Asian culture, the dragon is held in high regard, high status, as a majestic creature that is celebrated. I know in Japan, in many festivals and celebrations, there's people in costumes dancing with the dragon. So this year is a year of strength, authority, and success, a year where your dreams can come true. We talked a lot about goals through the testimonies, and actually our New Year's resolutions start with the year before, when you make the determinations and the plans. So then when the new year comes, you can already start acting on them. You've already began achieving your goals and setting out to succeed. So what has Mother said about this year then in her yearly message? She says we need to develop our surroundings and protect our environment. We need to protect our environment. We need to work together. If we do not have responsibility, there will be disruption. We must become true owners. We are one unified family. We must not be someone who goes back and forth, but we must be filial sons and daughters. So I've highlighted here two dynamic verbs, develop and protect. When I first read this, I thought, okay, our environment, and I started thinking more about protecting our environment. I think Mother is not just referring to the physical environment that we live in. We know that Mother's very concerned with sustainability, nature, and our surroundings. But really, our environment is our whole being, our community, our families, our tribes, the different spheres that we're involved in, work, education, clubs, hobbies, but also our physical selves, our spirituality, our beliefs, our values, our mental health, our physical health. We need to protect those things, we need to cherish them. And I really like Mother's use of the verb to protect. It's not passive. We have to stand up for what we believe in, we have to stand up for what is important in our lives. Not only protect it, but develop it further, make sure that it's flourishing, it's growing, and that the areas of our lives we want to protect are fruitful. So I really appreciate these words from Mother this year, some practical things that we can do to protect, stand up for the things that are important for you. When I was walking the dog the other day, there's, it's not quite a care home, I think it's like supported living, supported accommodation for elderly people at the end of my street. When I walk my dog past there, I'm often really upset because I see the same man sitting in front of his TV in his room when I walk the dog in the morning and when I walk the dog at the end of the day. And my heart really goes out for people like that because they're not mentally stimulated. He's just there in this supported accommodation in front of his TV. Is he protecting his mental health, his values? Is he standing up for what he believes in, keeping his mind active? Something I've noticed is that as people get older, those who are engaged in hobbies, stimulating their mind, really protecting themselves, often stay younger, stay fitter. So it was really heartbreaking to see this gentleman just sat there in front of his TV. So this year, we need to protect what we believe in, stand up for what we believe in, and develop it and nurture it. Next slide. Okay, so this year, Christmas time, we were in France. This is the cathedral in Rennes. This was the first time I went to a worship service on Christmas Day, which was, as you can see, is a very beautiful chapel. We visited it a few days prior when it was empty. And I thought, if I was given the sermon here, which I would love to have done, because it can seat around 400 people in there, which was my rough guesstimate. But if I was given the Christmas message there, what would I like to say? What would I tell people? So ask the person next to you, what would be your Christmas message if you were to preach to 400 people? What would you say? Ask the person next to you. Let's have some community engagement. You've been sat there a while. What would you tell 400 people if you had the opportunity to preach in this chapel, in this cathedral? So you have 400 people in this beautiful chapel, cathedral covered in gold. What would you say? Let's get some answers. Let's go with Uncle Ron. What would your Christmas message be to 400 people?
I would say that it's the time to actually love people, not talk about it, but to do it in practical terms.
Okay, to love people practically, super. Blanca, if you were to preach to 400 people, what would your sermon be? Okay. Super, the mission of Jesus. Yukiya-san, what would you preach about to 400 people? Okay, super. Do you want to do our Easter message then? Okay, so yeah,
we won't get persecution.
Yeah, the priest did talk about the birth of Jesus there. But I was asking myself, if I had this opportunity to speak to people on Christmas Day, 400 people as well, what would I say? This is where I came up with this idea for today's sermon. What will God ask of you? And this is a really, really scary question to ask God. If you ask God sincerely, you make yourself vulnerable, you come before God, and you genuinely ask, what do you want me to do this year? What direction of my life do you want me to go in? What's even scarier then is listening to God and actually doing what God asks you to do. And that's the part where I have so much fear and anxiety. I've noticed that I get answers from God very, very quickly, but I have trouble actually acting on it, implementing it. Last year, God told me very clearly, you need to spread my word, you need to go out there, you need to witness. And admittedly, I did not do enough. And at the end of last year as well, I was asking God, what do you want me to do this year? And I had several answers, and even to the point I was sharing in Birmingham last week, God got frustrated with me. He said, I've told you the answer, 3-4 times now, and that was a response I got from God. So how do we approach God? How do we deal with God's will and God's desires? I want to focus today on Abraham, actually, and how Abraham showed us how we deal with God's will and how we react to what God wants us to do. So if you just allow me to read Genesis 22. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said, Abraham, here I am, he replied. And God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain that I will show you. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. And he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to Abraham, Father. Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now that I know you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram, caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, and that because you have done this and not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the shores. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me. I think this is a beautiful biblical story that shows how Abraham has responded to God and to God's wills, especially because God has asked Abraham such large tasks. They're not menial things in comparison that God has asked me perhaps to go out, share my faith a bit more, to go out, visit people, to be a bit more active. First we know that God asked Abraham to make sacrifices in very certain ways, which he was unable to fulfill. But then God asked him to sacrifice his only son. And I'm sure when we think of what we need to do, they're very small in comparison to Abraham. And Abraham shows us the kind of faith and determination you need to be successful with God. Something that really moved me when I was reading and studying this is that Isaac is asked to carry the wood, and he's asked to take himself up. So essentially what Isaac is doing, he's symbolically carrying the cross, he's carrying the burden of the sacrifice. Even though he is going to be the sacrifice, he carries the wood up the mountain, and he has faith in his father, although there is no animal for a burnt offering. So Leviticus shows us that there's a very clear procedure of offering a burnt offering, usually the fat of the animal, and is usually a really prized animal. So with this in mind then, surely Isaac must have realised that there is no animal, but he had faith in his dad, and he even carried the wood, showing that he himself can be the sacrifice. As I explained during the Chonshin 1 prayer earlier, one of my goals is to understand more about the fall this year. I really want to understand how that felt for God and its implications and what really happened. And we can see that God is on this path of restoration, that because of the fall, even in this story, he's reaching out to Abraham to try and restore things and resolve what happened. He tells Abraham afterwards that his descendants will be numerous. And often this is interpreted as, okay, Abraham can have children because his wife was old and he was unable to. But this is really telling us that actually humanity can be saved with the work of Abraham. This can springboard God and his lineage and other prophets to come and resolve the issues that the world faces. And that when God tells him your descendants are as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sands on the seashore, that God is really hoping that he can save not just Abraham's family and his lineage, but everyone that came before and that everyone who comes afterwards. And this is really beautiful. And if we look at the stars and the sand, they're all individuals, yet completely unique, but part of a whole collective, still part of God's dominion, God's cosmos. So as us, as unique brothers and sisters, we are still one part of one whole despite our uniqueness. And this is really beautiful, God's heart to save. So I want to touch on God's determination a little bit more. So the divine principle tells us that Abraham could not separate the offerings from Satan. He did not cut the doves, the birds, to show the separation from Satan. Despite this, though, God's will is predestined. And I find this theological notion really interesting, but difficult to understand as well. That despite Abraham not being able to cut the doves, which was symbolising the separation from Satan, so that offering was invaded, God still had a plan. God did not give up. God gave Abraham this chance to sacrifice his son, to make amends, to lay this foundation of faith, which I find incredible, that despite everything that's happened, despite quote-unquote the failures previously, that God does not give up, that God's will is predestined. And that gives us a lot of hope for our lives today, with the difficulties we see in the world, our personal struggles, which some of you shared, that God has a plan and that his goodness is predestined, and no matter what, God will succeed in the end. It's quite interesting as well that God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son, and in the latter half of the Old Testament we see this, what Christians may call it the wrath of God or the judgment of God. But if God really is a God of love, then this story is a love story, not just a story of sacrifice and obedience. And actually, I think Karl Marx gave me the answer to this rather ironically, despite his negativity of religion. But he basically stated that in pre-agricultural times, in early history, people used religion as a way to cope with their environments and the way they live in. So if you have this in mind, in the time of Abraham, or perhaps in the time of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, they were an agricultural society. So often, things that happened in nature were deemed as acts of God. So perhaps if there was a famine, then they would need to offer more devotion so God can bless the farms, bless the crops, and help them be more plentiful. So with this in mind, then, the context of human understanding at the time, this was an act of love from God to give Abraham a chance to save humanity. Although it seems quite brutal to slay your son and offer your son as an offering, this was a context at the time. This is where the human understanding was, where they thought that God, was this God of wrath, this God which they had to try and please and offer offerings. So with this in mind, then, it's important to note that we have to develop our relationship with God, given the context that we live in. So of course today we don't do sacrifices, we don't engage in rituals like that. But we have to ask ourselves, what can we offer God in this time to help God realise his dream? Are we going to hinder God's predestination, or are we going to help it and move it along? I just want to read a quote from the Divine Principle. This is from page 214. And it says, God could work and take back Abraham and his son Isaac over the course of 2 generations. So this offering that Abraham made allowed God to reclaim not only Abraham but his whole family. So again, this idea of offering to God is not just for ourselves, but it's for the wider whole. So it's really beautiful that Abraham was able to salvage the mistakes of the past and offer this to God. Oops, sorry. So I want to touch a little bit on this foundation of faith, which the Divine Principle tells us about. What I find particularly useful for us is that it's a bit of what's the word? There's a bit of difficulty with creating a foundation of faith. You need to have some faith to start building your foundation of faith. But the story tells us here that we have to be prepared to give everything up in order to receive everything. So Abraham had to be prepared to sacrifice his only son. He had to prepare to sacrifice something that was so important for him to lay that foundation. So that tells us then, as people of faith, that we have to be prepared to give everything up in order to receive God, in order to receive love. We have to put ourselves in a position to sacrifice, to give, to offer something. But in return, we receive life. So the Divine Principle also states that Abraham was also resurrected to life, now loosed from all the ties with which Satan had bound him. So, rather ironically, by giving everything up, by preparing to sacrifice ourselves, our family, then he receives everything in return. He receives God's love, he receives rebirth, renewal. And this is what developing our foundation of faith is, this renewal, this recommitment to God, this revival to God's lineage. Before then, we can start building on it and building a foundation of substance, a substantial life of faith. Let's go to the next. And this is my favourite part of this Bible reading. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. And Abraham's answer was, here I am. So how many times in our life has God said, Peter, Peter? No answer, perhaps. Or Cain, no answer. Or Elliot, but no answer. But here Abraham, for the second time, says, here I am, straight away to God's calling, which I think is so beautiful and edifying to know that instantly he is saying, here I am, given the heat of the moment, he's about to sacrifice his son. He's got absolute commitment to God, to the point where he will sacrifice Isaac. Yet God calls out and he replies instantly. And since God is all powerful, all loving, all knowing, He's not like me, limited, where perhaps if I'm having a conversation with Uncle Mervyn and I can't have a conversation with Uncle Julian. God is calling out to all of us each and every day, continually calling out, waiting for our response. So the question is, do we respond, and then how do we respond to God's calling? Also, this story can give us a practical point for this year as well. What are our Isaacs that we need to sacrifice this year? What things do we need to do to be closer to God? What things may be holding us back that needs addressing? Just wanted to finish on what happens when we know God. This reading tells us that because Abraham feared God, then he could be closer to God. Actually, God is not a God of fear. God is a God of love. So this word fear, I think, should be understood in terms of respecting God's authority, respecting God's power, and understanding God's potential and God's creativity. And when we understand that, then we have no choice to submit to it, to submit to God's love. It's so overpowering, so consuming, we almost do fear its power. So I'd just like to end there with a question again. What are our Isaacs this year that we need to sacrifice? What do we need to give up this year in order to be closer to God? What offerings can we make?